Welcome into the Still Curtain podcast, everybody. Happy Monday. I'm Josh Yourish with you, and we're exactly 30 days away from the Steelers reporting to training camp in Latrobe. The big news in Pittsburgh, the Steelers have waived Trenton Thompson and Denzel Mims, and the Steelers have signed wide receiver Jacob Copeland. If you haven't heard about this, it's the biggest news in the city. I don't know what you've been up to. Copeland, a 2023 undrafted free agent from the Titans, spent time on the Steelers practice squad last year. Also, the Steelers claimed defensive lineman Willington Previllen off waivers from Atlanta. So big moves from the Steelers, fun stuff in the offseason. Obviously, I'm kidding. There's nothing going on in the world of the Pittsburgh Steelers right now other than pointless Justin Fields, Russell Wilson debates about who's been accurate in practice because no one's actually seen them play on the field. So instead of trying to make a story out of all of that, we're going to go backwards. We're going to go back in time and see if the Steelers maybe could have avoided that situation. I've talked before about how I kind of like what the Steelers are doing at quarterback. I'm a fan of the idea of taking a low-risk swing on Russell Wilson and a low-risk swing on Justin Fields. But could they have avoided that? Could the Steelers have avoided the Kenny Pickett situation, needing to draft him? Could the Steelers have avoided 7 straight years without a playoff victory? There's a way that they could have, and it's with some better drafting. We've seen the Steelers draft really well, at least relative to consensus mocks and consensus rankings under Omar Khan and Andy Weidel, and generally, I and we collectively, Steelers fans and media, feel pretty good about the first 2 drafts under Omar Khan. And everyone in football feels pretty bad about the last 5 drafts of the Kevin Colbert era. So let's go back and let's play with some hypotheticals. What could the Steelers have done? What options existed in the time? Who could they have taken that could have prevented this playoff drought, prevented a desperate need at quarterback that's going to likely hold a pretty talented but aging roster back? Because the Steelers look like they could be a playoff unit, but TJ Watt's getting older. Cam Hayward's getting older. Who knows what that defense is going to look like by the time they do get a quarterback in place, and maybe some better drafting in the last 5 years of the Kevin Colbert era could have offset that. So why did I pick 5 years? Well, that takes us back to 2018 to 2022. The 2017 draft, the Steelers got TJ Watt in the first round. I'm going to say that's a win for Kevin Colbert. Pretty good pick there. 2016, they took Artie Burns. That's a loss. 2015, Bud Dupree. Mixed results. Ultimately a win because he played really well with TJ Watt on the other side, and they decided not to ultimately pay him, which was the right decision. 2014, Ryan Shazier. Great until, of course, the injury. 2013, Jarvis Jones. Kind of a miss. 2012, DeCastro. 2011, Hayward. So it was mixed results for Kevin Colbert for a while. In the early 2010s, it was great results. It was DeCastro, Hayward, and Pouncey in 3 straight drafts. So really the window to look at is 18 to 22 because those are all clear misses. And it starts in 2018 with Terrell Edmunds, 2019 trading up for Devin Bush, 2020 Steelers didn't have a draft pick, but maybe that was a mistake too. 2021 Najee Harris, and 2022 Kenny Pickett. Najee Harris is the only one you could argue maybe a success, but considering draft value, taking a running back in the first round, generally most agree that not the best decision on Kevin Colbert's part. So that's what we're going to look at today, and we'll get right into it with the 2018 Steelers NFL draft and the pick of Terrell Edmunds. Now, Edmunds, not a bad player. He ultimately was a solid starting safety for the Steelers for multiple seasons. They brought him back for an extra year after declining his 5th-year option. They kept him around. He was functional as more of a box safety. He just wasn't a first-round pick. He wasn't really projected as a first-round pick going into that draft. The Steelers saw something. It was a heavily influenced pick by Mike Tomlin. He wanted a defensive back. The Steelers desperately needed a defensive back, but they reached on Edmonds, who, if Edmonds had been a third-round pick, a second-round pick like he was projected, Steelers fans largely would have been happy with the production that he gave. Edmonds was a functional starting safety for many years, just not a first-round pick, and that's why it feels so disappointing. Let's set the scene going into that draft. It was coming off the 2017 season. That was the 13-3 year, first in the AFC North, and a divisional round loss, 45-42 to the Blake Bortles Jaguars. That's also coming off the Ryan Shazier injury. Know that it's likely the end of his career, but not so certain. There's a lot of uncertainty at that point. They didn't know how big of a hole that was going to be, even though they obviously couldn't replace it in season. Players like Sean Spence and whoever they tried to cycle in at middle linebacker just didn't work. They needed help in the secondary desperately. We saw that with Mike Mitchell being horrible against the Jaguars and really that entire secondary. And in this draft, there were perfect Ryan Shazier replacements readily available. I've talked this offseason about how the Steelers finally got the Ryan Shazier replacement that they've been desperately searching for in signing Patrick Queen. They could have just had him if they stuck at the 28th overall pick in the 2018 NFL draft and took a couple of good options for middle linebackers. Now, obviously, the conceit of this exercise is how could we avoid a quarterback disaster? Well, at that point, Ben's still looking pretty good. Lamar Jackson was there as a possible option. He was sliding down the first round. That would take a massive change. They would have to completely change the offense, things we saw the Ravens be willing to do under John Harbaugh, and it certainly paid off for them. 2 MVPs so far. Not a lot of playoff success for our guy Lamar, and not much success against the Steelers either. That was an option, but realistically, it wasn't going to happen. Steelers were still happy with Ben, weren't going to make that drastic of an offensive shift. So there's no mistake there that could have avoided a quarterback disaster. What they could have done, however, as you can see up on the options, is they could have taken then Darius, now Shaq Leonard, a middle linebacker. They could have taken Fred Warner, who slipped all the way into the third round. There are reasons for that. He was more of an edge rusher when he was coming out of BYU. They used him in a lot of different ways. The 49ers saw a perfect role for him. The Steelers may not have seen that perfect role. They could have tried him on the edge because they still did kind of need edge help despite taking TJ the year before. And then safety Jesse Bates was another good option for the Steelers. He went in the second round, 54 overall. Leonard went 36 overall to the Colts, Bates to the Bengals, and Warner, obviously, we know, to the 49ers. And Shaq Leonard, while he is pretty much out of football now with debilitating injuries and his back just wasn't able to hold up, he was an excellent player for the Colts in their cover 2 scheme. And it's similar Tampa 2 stuff to what Mike Tomlin likes to run, where the middle linebacker is actually very important. And Leonard was fantastic in that role. He should have been the Steelers pick coming out of South Carolina State. Now, that's a bit of a stretch, but so was Edmonds because he wasn't projected as really a first-round pick. Leonard slips to 36. I'm not a huge fan of taking off-ball linebackers in the first round, but when it fills such a massive need and there weren't great options in the secondary outside of Bates, who was taken much later and is a little bit less realistic. Obviously, this is a hypothetical and we can be as unrealistic as we want, but we'll keep tethered to some aspects of realism and in the moment evaluations, because I think that's important to understand what could have been realistic options. And Leonard could have been that. And that's who I'll submit as my 2018 redraft. That one a little bit quicker because it's so easy. Shazier gets hurt. Edmonds is the pick. Edmonds doesn't really work out. We know that now with hindsight. He was okay, but not a perfect solution in the secondary. Take Shaq Leonard instead, and you keep on rolling. That takes us to the 2019 draft. And we know what the Steelers did in the 2019 draft after a year of trying to replace Ryan Shazier and being unable to replace Ryan Shazier in the middle of the defense. They traded number 20, number 52, and a 2020 third rounder. The number 20 pick eventually became Noah Fant. 52, they traded up for Drew Lock. This is the Broncos. And they got Lloyd Cushenberry with the 2020 third rounder. That's what the Steelers gave up for Devin Bush. And Devin Bush looked okay in his first year. His ACL injury derailed everything. We know that. We know it was a mistake now, that pick. And even with an injury, an undersized player like that and middle linebacker trying to play the way he was, playing sideline to sideline, obviously the injury takes so much of that speed element away from Bush, but I think we can safely assume now Bush was never going to be an elite off-ball linebacker, was never going to be worth trading up into the top 10 for. And we'll set the scene a little bit for that draft again. The Steelers finished 2018 9-6-1, second in the AFC North, missed the playoffs. The draft was loaded at defensive line, but at the time, the Steelers had Hayward, Hargrave, Tuitt, and in our theoretical worlds, Shaq Leonard behind them. So the run defense still very strong. The pass rush still very strong. Hargrave obviously getting a little later in that contract, and nobody knew that Stephon Tuitt would retire so early. You go into the 2019 draft feeling good about the defensive line. So players like, if the Steelers had still done this trade up, the best options really would have been Christian Wilkins, who went 13th and just got a massive contract from the Raiders because he's a great, impactful, quick interior defensive lineman. Dexter Lawrence, also out of Clemson, went 17th to the Giants. He's been more of a run stopper for the Giants, but a fantastic interior defensive lineman. And Jeffrey Simmons, who's the best of the bunch, who's coming out of Mississippi State and went number 19 to the Titans. Those would have been the best options for the Steelers if they had still done the trade up. But if you're not going for Bush, you're not doing that trade up because you don't need the D lineman as desperately as you felt like you needed a middle linebacker. And in our hypothetical world, you don't need a middle linebacker because you took Leonard the year before. The quarterbacks that year, because that's an important part of this, Kyler Murray went number 1, Daniel Jones number 6, Dwayne Haskins number 15, Drew Lock 42, and maybe the second best quarterback, second or third best, you could argue, with Daniel Jones. Gardner Minshew went in the 6th round, number 178. That's not going to be an option. None of those other than Murray. And you can have, if you want to tell me that Kyler Murray's not really a true franchise quarterback that you'd feel great about, I'll certainly listen to that argument. He's the best one, and he was unattainable at number 1 overall. So the quarterback position, not going to be fixed in the 2019 draft. There are a ton of options at wide receiver also in this draft. This is coming off the Antonio Brown trade. The Steelers feel good about Juju Smith-Schuster at this point, and they should, with 1,000-yard seasons as the number 2 to AB. The passing offense looked fantastic. And the Steelers also drafted Deontay Johnson in the 3rd round that year, pick 66. The one they got back from the AB trade from the Raiders. Colbert never used early picks on wide receivers. So even if he sticks and picks later in the 1st round, instead of trading up, guys like Deebo Samuel, guys like A.J. Brown, they're not real options for the way the Steelers operate. And they would have been excellent replacements for Antonio Brown because nobody knew how much Juju's production would fall off and the type of player he would regress into later in his career. And that leaves the offensive line, which the Steelers should have started addressing much earlier. Kevin Colbert did that in the early 2010s. That's how I opened this up. He took Pouncey and DeCastro in a 3-year stretch with Hayward in the middle, addressing the trenches. The defensive line's still good at this point in time. The offensive line is not. And there are some solid options at tackle Titus Howard went one in the first round, number 23 to the Texans. Jawan Taylor, who is now with the Chiefs, went to the Jaguars, 35th overall. The guy that the Steelers probably should have taken in this, if we're going back in a time machine and submitting a different card for Kevin Colbert, probably Caleb McGarry, who went 31st overall to Atlanta. He's been a solid right tackle for many years in the NFL, got a second contract from Atlanta. Not an all-pro caliber player, but considering what the Steelers had on the offensive line and were developing on the offensive line, players like Chuks Okorafor were coming. Al Villanueva was struggling a lot. Matt Filer was moving out to right tackle, and he was always much better inside at left guard. The O-line's falling apart. McGarry would plug that hole and be a foundational piece up front for the Steelers. Again, these first two, a little bit more meat and potatoes. Not as exciting. There are domino effects from them. The Steelers could have spent more on the secondary without needing to sign Mark Barron that offseason, which they did, 2 years, $12 million. They also signed Steven Nelson, $325. That's a good deal, a deal you would want to make again because there's still a need in the secondary. They could have spent more to upgrade it with players like Earl Thomas, Tyrann Mathieu. They were safeties available. Adrian Amos, Kareem Jackson, all upgrades over Edmonds, who they don't have in this hypothetical world. And they still give you the option to trade for Minkah Fitzpatrick the next year, which is what makes the 2020 draft probably the most interesting of this exercise, even though the Steelers don't have a first-round pick in that draft. So let's get to 2020. The first pick that the Steelers do use, Chase Claypool, number 49 overall. Steelers are coming off the 2019 season, the Big Ben injury. Don't know his future. He's planning on coming back, but you don't know how that elbow is going to respond. Just spent a year watching Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. By now, it's clear. Quarterback is a position of desperate need. That was clear in week 2 of 2019. Kevin Colbert did not address that position until the 2022 NFL draft. If we're playing out a world in which the Steelers still trade for Minkah Fitzpatrick, which for the value was a great trade. They gave up the 18th overall pick to Miami. They took Austin Jackson, an offensive lineman out of USC, who didn't materialize at tackle, moved inside to guard, has been more serviceable, was more serviceable at guard, but is not an impact offensive lineman in the NFL. Got Chase Claypool, who produced 11 touchdowns in his rookie year. The options right behind Chase Claypool, these are the next 4 picks after Claypool. Jalen Johnson, who just got a big contract, the cornerback in Chicago, who would have been an excellent addition to an aging and not too talented secondary. Trayvon Diggs, who won a Defensive Player of the Year for Dallas. Cam Akers, a running back, and Jalen Hurts went right after Akers. So there were some intriguing options right there instead of taking Claypool. We'll keep with the Claypool pick in this exercise because 11 touchdowns in that rookie year, that was incredibly valuable, and it netted the pick that became Joey Porter Jr. when Omar Khan was able to flip Claypool to the Bears for their second round pick years later. Here's the alternate situation, the one that's a lot more fun, the one that could solve the Steelers' problems. The argument I was making at the time as a college freshman when the Steelers made this trade. Why are you giving up a first-round pick when you finally have your out? You finally have your reason to start rebuilding, start looking to the next era, start finding that next quarterback. You give up your first-round pick that year? For what? Minkah Fitzpatrick's been an all-pro player. The Steelers had no direction the second they made that trade because the team didn't have a quarterback. It was Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges. Even if that team could have scratched and clawed and Minkah pick-sixed its way to the playoffs, those quarterbacks are not winning you games in the playoffs. So why is that trade made? It has confounded me to this day. I love Minkah Fitzpatrick. He could be my favorite Steeler. He might be. He's a fantastic player. He's been a fantastic Steeler for everything that means outside of just performance on the field. The Steelers shouldn't have made that trade. It makes no sense. And it makes no sense when you add even more context. It was a move made to desperately hold on to Mike Tomlin's record of non-losing seasons. Colbert should have seen the Ben injury as a chance to bottom out. Minkah became an all-pro that season. He saved the season, whatever that means, to go 8-8. The Steelers started the year 0-3 with a negative 36-point differential. They were 0-2 when they traded for Minkah. Minkah finished the year with 5 interceptions, a touchdown, 2 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, and a fumble recovery return for a touchdown. I don't know if we even remember how great Minkah was that year. He may have been the best defensive player in the NFL. The Steelers ended up giving Miami the 18th pick. But the 6-10 Browns, remember the Steelers went 8-8, the 6-10 Browns got the number 10 pick. Minkah flipped the Indianapolis game, absolutely. That was a 2-point win. He had a pick 6. Make that one go the other way, 7-9. The Rams game was a 5-point win with a fumble recovery touchdown and a Minkah interception. Flip that one, 6-10. You're picking 10th overall, maybe 9th. Tiebreakers come into effect. Easily could have been 6-10 or worse without Minkah, because that team rallied off of everything he brought, off of him turning the year around. The 5-10-1 Cardinals picked 8th, and the 5-11 Chargers picked 6th. There were not a lot of terrible teams in football that season. The Bengals were one of them. They got the number 1 overall pick and took Joe Burrow. Miami wanted to be one of them, and they couldn't even bottom out. That's how many mediocre teams there were in the NFL. The Dolphins got Tua Tagovailoa at number 5. Justin Herbert went to the 5-11 Chargers at number 6. Steelers could have easily been 5-11 that season without the Minkah trade. And throw on top of that, Jordan Love went number 26. And now he looks like a quality starting quarterback in the NFL. I mentioned before, Jalen Hurts went 52. If the Steelers got up to 8, 10, somewhere in that range, held on to that pick, they could have easily traded up for whoever they liked the most out of that group. Went up and got Herbert. Couldn't have gotten Burrow, but you could have gotten Tua if you believed in him. And there are certainly still reasons to believe in Tua. Would need a better offensive coordinator to cater to his strengths, his decision-making, his vision, field vision, the things that make Tua a good quarterback. Maybe he's not the answer, but he's better than the options the Steelers have now and the options that they had then, which was an aging Ben with a noodle arm and an offense that was completely non-functional. The 2020 draft was the most successful in terms of first-round quarterbacks. 4 quarterbacks were taken that year and taken in the first round that year, all received a second contract with the same team. 2 was waiting on his, but he will get it. So that's 4 quarterbacks who the team is saying is our franchise guy, or we at least believe in him enough to give him the second deal beyond his rookie deal. That's the most since 1983, when John Elway, Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, Ken O'Brien were all multiple contract starters for the team that drafted them. And you throw on top of it Jalen Hurts, who got a mega deal from the Eagles. So that's 5 multiple contract starters in that draft. Now, I'm not saying Burrow and Herbert and Tua and Hurts and Love are on the caliber, or any of them are on the caliber or ever will be, of an Elway, a Marino, a Kelly. It's just in terms of success rate, the binary yes and no of quarterback drafting. Yes, he got a second contract. That means he's at least good enough. Something Kenny Pickett didn't and won't get from now the Eagles. Busts don't get it. Quarterbacks who are remotely playable good do. That draft had 5. And the Steelers, when their quarterback suffered a potentially career-threatening elbow injury, traded their first round pick for a free safety and missed out on all of it. It's not necessarily the best quarterback draft we've seen since 83. It's the most volume. You could have had a chance at one of those guys. Could have traded back for Jordan Love, up for Justin Herbert. Even if you ended up at 18 and you still had that, you could have taken Jordan Love. He would have needed some development. And we know Ben didn't want to develop a young quarterback. We knew that with the Mason Rudolph situation. Neither did Aaron Rodgers, and Jordan Love still turned into a quality starter. Could have given him a little bit of runway at least with Ben coming back. It's a confounding decision to make that trade, and it's the move that I point to the most with what as the move that knocked the Steelers off course. After that trade, the franchise had no direction. Were they trying to win now when the quarterback was clearly in decline and coming off of a major injury? Why is that the plan? You still had a younger defense at that point. You could try to get the quarterback in time for TJ Watt to be still in his prime, and he still is, but they still don't have the quarterback yet. Cam Hayward is on the tail end of his extended prime and still don't have the quarterback. And largely it's because of the Minkah Fitzpatrick trade. One of my favorite Steelers, a player who unequivocally succeeded and was worth more than the 18th overall pick, which is ultimately what they gave up for him. But that decision knocked the Steelers off course. And it is arguably Kevin Colbert's worst in terms of recognizing the situation, the value of the quarterback position, and the direction of his team, the timetable of his team. It's a big reason the Steelers are where they are right now, which is quarterback purgatory. Waiting for Fields to maybe pop, Wilson to turn it around, hoping for that, not even waiting. If the Steelers had not given up that first round pick, maybe things would look a lot different. Hey, Steelers fans, maybe you think I'm wrong. Maybe you think the Steelers are contenders this year. Maybe you think Wilson or Fields will have a great year and lead the Steelers to the playoffs. Maybe you think I'm right and you want to fade the Steelers. You can do it at DraftKings. DraftKings is offering a fantastic sign-up bonus for new users. New customers can place a $5 first bet on any sport to instantly claim $150 in bonus bets when you sign up with our code FSBETS. The best part is that you will receive your rewards even if your first bet loses. Using our code FSBETS not only gets you these bonuses, but it also directly supports our podcast. If you've been considering signing up for DraftKings, make sure to use the code FSBETS to maximize your first bets. This offer is only available to new customers who are 21 plus and physically present in legal gambling states. Please remember to always gamble responsibly. Check out the episode description for the full terms of the offer to see if you qualify. And that brings us to the Najee Harris draft. the 2021 draft, and another horrible mistake from Kevin Colbert, the Hall of Fame GM. This isn't rip on Kevin Colbert. He built fantastic teams. The end wasn't pretty in the draft, and it could have avoided a mess that Omar Khan is doing a good job of cleaning up now, but a mess nonetheless. Najee Harris has had productive seasons, and coming off this goes along with the Steelers not knowing their direction and lying about how good of a team they were. They were coming off the 2020 season where they went 12-4 and won the AFC North and lost to the Browns in the wild card round. That team was fraudulent. That team was never a contender. It was smoke and mirrors. The 2020 Steelers were never going to compete in the playoffs. The Browns proved that to them. Kevin Colbert did not listen. Running backs, I'm okay with first-round running backs. I am. The analytics guys may think that's blasphemous, but I'm okay with them in certain circumstances. When it's the last piece on a championship roster, when it's somebody who can be dynamic enough to take an offense to a new height for a team that's competing in the immediate and wants to run the wheels off that guy. I'm okay with those circumstances. That was not the Najee Harris situation. Steelers had massive flaws on their roster, especially the offensive line, and instead took a running back and said, figure it out with this terrible offensive line. The Steelers needed just about every spot on the offensive line going into that draft. They needed cornerback. They needed quarterback as well. Steven Nelson, Joe Hayden, Cam Sutton. It's a decent group at corner, but you need some young players there. They needed defensive line help with the Tuitt injury, and at that point, they didn't know that he was never coming back. But the writing may have been on the wall, especially if you're inside that building every day. And obviously, Ben was coming off a year with 33 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, threw for nearly 4,000 yards. But it was clear that it's not sustainable long term. The end was near. The QBs in that draft, Trevor Lawrence, he went number 1, Zach Wilson number 2, Trey Lance number 3, Justin Fields number 11, Mac Jones number 15, Kyle Trask went 64, Kellen Mond 66, David Mills 67. No thank you across the board except Trevor Lawrence, and that's unattainable at number 1 overall. Justin Fields, I still have hope for, but we have him now. Why would we go back and trade up for him? Wouldn't make much sense. The best options for the Steelers, instead of taking Najee Harris at 24, which was incredibly predictable and short-sighted, Greg Newsome. He went 26th overall to Cleveland. Cornerback and plays primarily in the slot. Would have been a good Cam Sutton replacement. We knew the end was coming at some point for him. Joe Hayden was nearing the end as well. Steven Nelson reaching the end of his contract. Newsome could have been a good option. Javon Holland at 236 to Miami, the second round 36 pick. A really impressive safety who's an impact player at the second, third level of the Miami defense. And in my hypothetical world, I haven't taken Edmonds, and I've argued strongly against trading for Minka, so that's certainly a need as well. Tevin Jenkins, who I wanted at the time, who went 39th overall to Chicago, didn't work at tackle, has some injury concerns, kicked into guard for Chicago, and actually has been a really good run blocker. And Creed Humphrey, who should have been the pick. He went 63rd overall. Obviously, this is hypothetical, and the Steelers had a crack at him in the first and the second. The Chiefs got him 63rd overall. He should have been a first-round pick, and it would have been great if the Steelers had gotten him. They just watched Pouncey in tears on the bench with Ben, knowing he was going to retire. And you could have got the best center in that draft. Landon Dickerson was in the conversation for that, but the Eagles moved him to guard. Humphrey has been dominant in KC, protecting Mahomes, and would have been a much more worthy successor at center than Kendrick Green. And you're saying this is about solving the quarterback problem. How does that help? Blocking on the interior is something that quarterbacks look for and value, finding a destination, especially veterans. Maybe the Steelers could have gotten in the market to land a veteran. There's been a lot of veteran quarterback movement since then. Having a guy like Humphrey in the middle doesn't hurt. Also doesn't hurt the development of a young player if you bring him in. Again, a running back just should never be the pick, especially when you don't seem to have a clear direction as a franchise. That's knocking you further off course. The Najee pick, also one of the worst. I still can't reconcile why they made that decision with everything we've learned about the NFL since players like Saquon Barkley went second overall and Ezekiel Elliott went in the top 5. We've learned so much, and yet the Steelers still said, we'll take Najee, 24th overall. It's not solving your problems. The Steelers in 2022, as it brings us there, and before we get there, I'd like to say if you're a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate your support. The 2022 draft. Kevin Colbert is trying to fix more mistakes. He didn't address quarterback in time. Now he has to. And everyone in the league knows that the Steelers are drafting a quarterback at 20 overall. And everyone in the league is happy to let them have him. Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis were the best options coming into that draft. And I will admit, at the time, I wanted the Steelers to draft Malik Willis. That doesn't sound like a flex in this moment because Malik Willis certainly didn't work out. Kenny Pickett's the better player of the two. The reason that I wanted that so desperately is not because I thought for sure he'd be better than Pickett. I knew he had more physical talent and a higher physical athletic ceiling. He had a bigger arm. He was faster, things that are valuable. And he was likely to be a boom or bust player, which would at least give the team an answer. If he's great, you keep him. You have your quarterback. If he's terrible immediately, at least you know that. And my fear was that the Steelers and Kevin Colbert at the time were going to talk themselves into Kenny Pickett no matter what. Because the most important thing at quarterback is if you're wrong, you got to accept it quickly and move on. You don't want to pay the Daniel Jones contract because you're scared you won't have a quarterback. You're better off not having one at all than paying Daniel Jones $45 million a year. And I was terrified of a Daniel Jones contract for Kenny Pickett. Luckily, Omar Khan proved me wrong because Kenny Pickett was not playable, was not a passable starting quarterback. Omar Khan recognized that, and he cut bait as quickly as he realistically could. I didn't expect that from the Steelers organization, and I'm thrilled that it's the decision they made. So instead of going back in this and saying we'll swap out Willis for Pickett because that's what I would have done in the moment, we can look at some of the other needs. The Steelers needed offensive line, defensive line, cornerback. They needed a lot of things, not just a quarterback. And Kevin Colbert was so fixated on drafting for his most desperate need at the end of his tenure, and that got him into a lot of trouble. There was also another desperate need, obviously wide receiver, but they got Pickens in the second round. It was at left tackle. That year, Dan Moore Jr. allowed 48 pressures. That's in 2021, despite Ben Roethlisberger having an absurdly fast 2.25 second time to throw, the fastest in the NFL by a significant margin. Second was Colt McCoy at 2.31. That's in 2021. Colt McCoy even playing in 2021 doesn't sound right. The Steelers had options. They had Trent McDuffie that went 21st overall to the Chiefs. Tyler Smith, who went 24th overall to the Cowboys, a tackle guard from Tulsa. Tyler Linderbaum, the center out of Iowa, who I desperately wanted at the time. He went 25th to the Ravens, and Steelers have had to deal with him quite a bit. It's not the most fun. Devontae Wyatt is the only real option at defensive line. He hasn't panned out very much in Green Bay, so stay away from Wyatt. The best option here is Tyler Smith. He's playing elite level guard in Dallas and has been playing elite level guard in Dallas with Tyrone Smith at left tackle. The Steelers could just start him at left tackle over Dan Moore Jr. Even with Mitch Trubisky being your quarterback, which is not a solution at quarterback, that's better because you're not reaching for a position that you need desperately because you didn't do enough to address it before it became a massive problem. That was the main issue with the end of the Kevin Colbert era. It was letting small problems become gaping holes on your roster and then desperately scrambling to plug that hole when you're not in championship contention anyways. Whichever scenario you play out, the Steelers with Herbert or Love, if you don't make the Minka trade and it works out how I dream, or the Steelers with Mitch and Mason. QB was a huge need, but one that was not going to be effectively filled in the 2022 NFL Draft. Pickett was a reach as a first-round pick at the time, as Willis would have been, which the league showed us. Willis fell into the third round. And as Omar Khan and Andy Weidel have shown us since taking over the Steelers front office, offensive line is almost always an effective way to build through the draft. It's a foundational piece that helps everything around it on that side of the ball. And I predict that the Steelers offense will be a lot better because they've drafted tackles in back-to-back drafts and Zach Frazier in the second round this year, retooling that offensive line. That investment goes a long way. It would have gone a long way then. The Steelers had chances to retool the roster in the TJ Watt, Cam Hayward prime on defense. But Kevin Colbert was too stubborn to realize that's what the team needed. Instead, he drafted for need every year, and it caused 5 straight first-round misses. The Minka one, I'll give you that maybe as a win because I love Minka Fitzpatrick as a player. And those misses kept the team from having a losing season or ever landing the quarterback of the future. Omar Khan still doesn't have that guy, but he realized that for a team stuck in the middle, building up front, building through the trenches can give a football situation clarity and make it a great environment for either quarterback development or reclamation. That's what the Steelers should have realized in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. Finally, they did in 2023, 24. I just hope it's not too late for the timeline of the Pittsburgh defense, because by the time the Steelers finally do get the quarterback of the future, the quarterback of the franchise, maybe it's going to be time to start rebuilding that side of the ball. And that could be the worst nightmare for Steelers fans. I appreciate you playing along with my hypotheticals and going through that redraft, seeing how the Steelers could have maybe avoided the situation they're in right now. Far from the worst situation in the NFL, far from the best, though, too. And maybe some better picks with hindsight, which is a lot easier to do than what Kevin Colbert was tasked with doing. Could have avoided a Justin Fields, Russell Wilson training camp quarterback competition in 2024, because while it might be fun from a media perspective, that might not be the most fun outcome on the field this season. So thanks for watching along and playing along with me. Let me know, reach out on Twitter, reach out in the YouTube comments who you would have taken in these drafts and how you think the Steelers could have managed those drafts under Kevin Colbert to maybe avoid a long playoff drought, which we could be heading into year 8 of. Thanks so much. This has been the Still Curtain Podcast. I'm Josh Yourish. Till next weekend, goodbye.